Associated Press, and I'd like to thank everyone on this last day for coming to our session on building better tools to understand voters and their choices. Joined by a couple of great folks today, Peter Boucher from Cortico and MIT's Media Lab, Ashley Alvarado from Southern California Public Radio, and Julia Haslinger from Harkin. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, let me tell you a story. In my previous job, I was the politics editor at AP. I ran our politics coverage in 2014 and 2016. And one December, as I was trying to focus on the holidays, I got a press release from the Trump campaign that said this, which was amazing. So amazing, in fact, that I called Corey Lewandowski. I'm like, is this real? Are we being hoaxed? Because it was so striking that a presidential candidate, who at the time was doing quite well, would propose banning an entire religious group from coming into the United States. And my reaction was pretty typical to everyone else's reaction in Washington. The next day, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, leaders of the Republican Party, other candidates in the race, all came out with universal condemnation of the president's, or the future president's proposal on travel and Muslims in the United States. And so we wrote a story that said this, that it was his call, course, near universal. There was no debate. This was a ridiculous idea. It was highly offensive. There was no daylight in the party. It was very much, this is not something that we should be doing here in the United States. So what's the next thing we did? Well, of course, we wanted to talk to real voters. One of my mantras as politics editor is that elections are not about candidates, they're about voters. So let's go talk to a bunch of voters and see what they think about this. So we sent reporters out to 3 early voting states. South Carolina was next on the calendar. And we did diner reporting, right? We went to every restaurant. You couldn't get a plate of eggs in the upstate of South Carolina without an AP reporter asking you what you thought about the president's proposal or the future president's proposal. And we got something completely different. To a Republican voter in the upstate of South Carolina, where we situated this story, they said that this was the greatest thing that they'd ever heard. They were waiting for a presidential candidate to say this, that they couldn't understand why we were even asking the question. It wasn't even so much that they didn't understand why people like Paul Ryan were asking the question. They couldn't understand why we had to ask the question. It was because we should understand this. We should know this. We should know that what Trump was saying was absolutely the right thing to do. And so we wrote this story. And I tell this story a lot because it speaks to sort of the disconnect between what we are as political reporters and voters on the ground. But in hindsight, as I've told this story often, I've actually come to a different realization. It's not that we weren't doing good voter reporting. It's that we didn't even have the tools that we needed to understand what was taking place in the electorate. And so when we published that first story that says everyone is condemning this, it's universal, the voters and the electorate, they look at us and say, you don't understand what's going on. You don't understand what we're talking about. You don't understand us. And then when we show up in their communities and we ask them what appear to them to be dumb, obvious questions and then report it back to them, they say, look at these folks. They show up, they parachute in, they don't know our communities, they don't know what we're talking about, they're asking the wrong questions. I don't want to talk about the president's Muslim ban. It's obvious to me. As I learned later, working with Peter and looking at some research from MIT's Media Lab and at Cortico, the conversations that we were talking about in the political press in 2016 were at times completely opposite from what voters were talking about in their communities. We didn't even know the right questions to ask. And then I got to the end of the campaign when I rely on the exit poll to tell me what just happened. And of course, that night I looked at the exit poll results and I looked at what was actually happening in the vote count and realized I didn't have any data at all. I had nothing to pull back because the exit poll was so off, its methodology was so broken that I couldn't, even in the aftermath of the election, explain what had just taken place. So, not unlike a bunch of us, we've started looking at building some new tools at AP and a lot of other places to try to figure out how can we better report on voters. We need to be able to converse with them about the things that they're talking about, and it goes to that issue of trust that Amy was just talking about in the other room. If they see us asking the wrong questions, if they see us coming into their communities and talking to them about things that they're not interested in, The disconnect and the mistrust that exists today between us and the voters will only grow. We need a better way to communicate that is more than just showing up at diners and asking folks what they think about what we think they're talking about. So today, I'm going to share with you, hopefully, this group will share with you some tools that we've built. It's the first step in doing a better job of meeting voters where they are and learning about the things that they're talking about, that they want to talk about in terms of elections and politics and what they want from their candidates. So that's our session today. I'm glad you all could make it. And we're going to start with Peter Boucher, who's from Cortico and MIT's Media Lab, to talk about a tool that we've been playing around with called Earshot.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, David, for having me as a part of the panel. I'm Peter Boucher. I'm a design technologist at Cortico. We're a nonprofit centered inside of the MIT Media Lab focused on fostering a healthier public sphere. And we all know over the past several years that local news has atrophied, and as a result, there's many voices that are going underheard, and community concerns aren't as well reflected in the media. And so we thought, well, how can we help assist journalists with this problem with their increasingly limited resources? We thought, okay, well, if you want to know what people are saying in a community, what do you do now? Do you go to Google and search, what are people in Boston saying about immigration? This isn't going to work, right? You're going to see articles that are maybe a couple years old. You're not going to see what people are actually saying. And so we said, well, what if we built a tool where you could ask that same question, but it was focused on supporting locally grounded journalism, locally grounded storytelling for people that care about the community, like journalists and others. This is exactly what we've been working on at Cortico the past few months, the tool we call Earshot. It's a tool that lets you search for local voices in your community and hear what they've been saying. To start with, we've started off with a couple data sources, Twitter and talk radio. So the Twitter is localized to an area, and the talk radio we added because people come and talk to us and said, sometimes I'm listening to talk radio and I just feel like I'm on a different planet. The people that I'm hearing are just saying totally different things than what I'm hearing elsewhere. And we said, well, how do we help journalists tap into this source? It's just so different. And so what we did is we built a system that's currently ingesting over 160 stations nationwide, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, transcribing automatically every word that's said on the radio. Now, it's not perfect. The accuracy is not 100%, but it's good enough to support an effective search system. And we're always hoping to expand to more and more stations to eventually cover all the talk radio stations across the nation. And beyond talk radio and Twitter, we do hope in the near future to include community conversations. It's another initiative we're running at Cortico that involves expanding to local libraries across the nation and having facilitators there where you can go and speak at a conversation center and express your worries and concerns and hopes for your community that can then be surfaced in a tool like this with additional analytics to help journalists and researchers understand the community better. And of course, in time, we want to expand to cover more resources like media and governmental sources and town halls and things of that nature. So I want to give a quick demo of what Earshot is like today. So if we were looking at data in Boston in the last week, we could imagine searching for immigration. I'm sorry if the text is too small. Hopefully we can see it. And we're going to see some search results coming from talk radio and Twitter, in this case, talk radio. We start off with it's very early stage, but we have a simple analysis that says, okay, here are the top terms, gives you an at-a-glance view of what we're showing in the radio results. So there's a lot of talk of illegal immigration, a little bit about Canadians, immigration reform. Now each little snippet on the radio comes with a little bit of metadata. We're able to detect if the person talking is a call-in or a host. And we're able to detect to some degree of accuracy the gender of the person calling in or the expected gender. And you can actually filter on these. So if you say, I only care about people calling in, I want to hear the voices of people calling in, which is really the focus of our application, you can filter on these and see which stations they happened on. Now, say you want to scroll through and you're going to look for something that's going to catch your eye. Maybe you find something of interest. You can click to play and listen to a little snippet.
Dad was a janitor in the Newton Y. My dad, Italian immigrant, he went to the 8th grade. I'm not a rich lawyer.
And so maybe you find that interesting. You can click to see a bit more context around there, and maybe you can find where the caller was introduced.
Joining us now is Marilyn Petito Devaney. I know Marilyn. She's a governor's counselor and incumbent. She's the cousin of...
So here, actually, this was a day before the primaries in Massachusetts when I recorded this video, and it was someone calling in as a governor's counselor incumbent to state her platform or her position on some issues. And so you can imagine how this can be useful in the upcoming election to track what politicians are saying on the radio and what the response is there as well. Now, beyond radio, we do have some local Twitter, which is what you might expect. We can see what people are locally saying about immigration here, and it's not perfect either. Everything's getting better day by day, but here you can see just examples of people who are local Bostonians talking about immigration. Beyond search, we wanted to provide an ability to help journalists see a bit more of what they might be missing in these channels. And so we had this idea of a Discover platform where we can look at analytics of what's being covered on the radio and on Twitter in the location that you're concerned with. And so here we have a view that gives you some basic analytics of what's unusually being talked about on Boston in that week and what's popular in Boston that week that's kind of normal. And so in this week, it was Brett Kavanaugh. There's some primary election things and things about funeral happening during that week. And this stuff is a work in progress. We're getting better day by day, but it's an insight. So you can say, oh, why are they talking about that? Why is that popular on the radio? I didn't know that was even being spoken about. And you can click through to see the results. On Twitter, we're experimenting with a different approach, which is taking all the data and clustering it into topics, and then trying to select representative tweets that can summarize what you're looking at. And here we see 2 tweets about the primaries, one from Mike Capuano, who ended up losing to Ayanna Pressley. These 2 were both brought up as kind of representative popular topics in the Boston area of the day. And if you don't care about Boston, we do support a number of other locations. The green ones are places we have Twitter and radio. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of states that we have radio stations in. And so in Texas, we have 11 stations we're currently ingesting. And we can see how it varies here. A lot of the same national issues on the left, but some different local ones on the right. Now, while Earshot is still a fairly early product, we have had a great success story written by the AP reporter Michelle Smith, who through the radio search capabilities was able to capture a gubernatorial candidate speaking on an infomercial hosted by a lobbyist. And he didn't report this on his campaign records. And so this story was actually picked up by over 90 news outlets, was kind of the entry into the evening news on the prominent TV station WJAR in Rhode Island, and also was on the front page of the Providence Journal in the print edition. So if you're curious about trying this in your own community or taking part in the design or using Earshot, we're very big on participatory design and love communicating with journalists to figure out the position of where the product should go in the future. We'd love to have you sign up for the beta and communicate with me. There's some cards on the side table if you don't have this URL, and maybe around I try to disseminate them around the venue as well. So thank you.
So Peter, the Twitter and the talk radio is great, and certainly as politics editor, it was always tough to know what was going on radio in places far flung. But what do you see on the horizon in social listening and social machines that might become additional inputs to Earshot, or other research you guys are doing that would advance this to the next level?
That's a great question. And so I touched briefly on the idea of these conversation centers, which is a big initiative we're focusing on right now at Cortico, which is it's kind of overwhelming, but the idea is to go and actually build these. We have these physical boxes where you go and you speak with a volunteer who's in your community, someone that you can trust about issues in your community. And there you can we've prototyped this in Mott Haven, in the Bronx in New York. It's the poorest congressional district, and we've had such an interesting result of what people come in and say that it seems like a really promising thing to continue on, and we're going to be looking at deploying that in Madison in the upcoming mayor's election there to see how it performs, but ideally in 3 to 4 years seeing it expand across the nation. In addition to things like, we would love to have capturing town halls in your local community and other public records, whether it's things governmental people are saying, or if it's different social media sources like Reddit. Facebook would be nice, but it's a bit challenging right now. But there's lots of great sources where people are speaking, and the more that we can have to understand a wider grasp of what people are saying in your community, the better.
Great. Well, Earshot's still in beta, but Julia, you guys had things in the field in 2016. You want to tell us about some of which tools you were using then?
So hi, I'm with Harkin. Harkin is a company that works with newsrooms ahead of publication to sort of help them collect audience questions that can guide the kinds of stories they report. So we're a mix of both a technology and a consulting service. So in 2016, so Harkin was founded in 2015. So 2016, we were still a pretty young company, but we had several newsroom partners do really interesting projects. One of my favorite was here in Texas. KUT sort of championed this project with where they had 5 other newsroom collaborators across the state, and they all collected questions from their various radio station audiences. So they just said, what questions do you have about the 2016 election in Texas? It was a very open-ended question, and they just knew that they wanted it to be focused on questions about Texas, not questions about the national races. So the questions here over on the right are 5 of the 6 stories that they reported. So those are all questions that audience members of those newsrooms sent to those newsrooms, and then the reporters took those questions and reported out answers to them. And they're the kinds of questions that the newsroom would not have otherwise done. The managing editor of KUT, Matt, who sort of championed this project, had said, politics coverage is not always the most read content on our site, especially when it's like responsible local reporting. And so they wanted to find a way to make politics interesting and accessible and understandable to the people in Texas. And so this was the way they sort of tested it out in 2016. And it went really well for them. They got dozens of questions in. One of the nice things about how Harkin works is as the questions came in, the newsroom sort of could go through and say, all right, these are some good questions, but we don't know which one of these is most worth our time. So then they put them up for a vote. They said, okay, audience, here are the questions you sent in. Which of these 3 that are our favorites is your favorite? And then they knew before they put any reporter on that story that their audience really wanted and needed this story. And they were able to sort of let people know, we did this story because you told us it was important to you. So it's a really good way of trust building. Over the course of the 2016 election, we also had a couple of other newsrooms use Harkin as well around the election, including New Hampshire Public Radio used it to collect questions for candidates ahead of in-studio interviews and live town halls and live debates. And also WAMU in Washington used Harkin to collect questions that they then answered in their voter guide. So we saw a couple of really good examples over the 2016 election. We had some sort of best practices that we learned from that, which is it's really, as Harkin is always about listening and listening to questions, we found that elections are a really good time to listen to your audience's questions because there's a lot of things that people don't know, both about elections and about candidates. One of the things that is always a little bit tricky with every Harkin project, and that's sort of where our consulting services come in, is it's hard to write a prompt that gets somebody to ask the kind of question you're hoping they're going to ask, because it needs to be narrow enough that they're going to send you a question about, say, Texas politics and not national politics, but not so narrow that you're asking them to ask a question about a race they know nothing about. So finding that sort of balance between broad and narrow. One of the things is to make sure that you are sharing the invitation. So as you know, people don't see things on your social feed when you put them out once. You need to put them out a lot. People don't necessarily hear it the first time you make a call out on air for people to send in questions. You really need to share that invitation. And if you're trying to reach audiences that are not already in your core audience, you need some ambassadors to help you. You need some people to go out into the community, visit people, talk to them one-on-one, go to events, and really make sure that they know that they are welcome to engage with you in this way. One thing that is important when you're sort of setting these projects up is to set expectations with your audience about how many questions you think you're going to be able to answer. So don't say, we're going to answer every question that comes in unless you mean it. You guys did that once, and you were fantastic. But you're the only newsroom I think we've ever had that has answered every question that came in around a certain prompt. So it's really good to set expectations to be like, we're going to answer a few questions that come in. We're going to answer the questions you vote for, something like that. And then we have this term that our founder, Jen Brandel, has recently coined, which is don't be an asshole. Don't just ask people for things and then don't do anything with it. Actually, make sure you're giving them some value for participating with you. And then it's really, it can be deceiving for journalists because we're very comfortable with asking questions and we ask questions about our community all the time. And so we're like, how could somebody else have a better question about the community than I have when it's my job to spend all day thinking about questions that I have about my community? But it turns out that your audience really does have better questions than the people who work in your newsroom because you guys are just a very small sample of everyone in your community and people have different levels of exposure to different topics and different comfort levels and different life experiences than the people in your newsroom. And it's really valuable and important to listen to their questions and not just the questions of the people you have on staff. So that's sort of what we learned in 2016.
Great. I set this up with doing the hand mic, and that was probably a mistake because now we have to pass it back. But tell us more about what's going to happen in 2018 and 2020. What types of projects are you working on? What's sort of like, as you've got it framed here, what's the evolution of Texas Decides?
Thanks. So TX Decides, after they had their good success in fall 2016, they sort of went to the other newsrooms, the other 5 newsrooms that they were collaborating with, and said, okay, do you guys want to keep doing this? Because this seems to be going really well. We were able to get some good stories that we wouldn't have otherwise reported. They had good traffic. Our readers seemed to really appreciate it. So they, in February 2017, launched What Questions Do You Have About Lawmaking? So the Texas legislature is only in session once every 2 years. If you're from a different state, that can seem very weird. But it's sort of like all hands while the legislature is in session, since it's such a rare activity. But it also means that people in your audience aren't necessarily familiar with how the legislature works. So this was a chance for them to get questions from their audience about how does the lawmaking process work. So it was a mix of questions that they got in, both about like, how does something go from committee to something else, but also questions about like, why are we talking about the bathroom bill? Like, what happened that made the bathroom bill a thing? So it's both questions about the context of the news and also the process of lawmaking. The legislature went into a special session, so they launched a special session, like, let us help you understand how special sessions work, and that was a lot of questions like, who pays for it? How much does it cost every day? Really interesting questions because it's such a rare moment in a state that the legislature goes into special session. And then they, this year, started in January, collecting questions again about the primaries, and they're gonna they're relaunching again this fall around the midterms. So it's been a real success for this collaborative group of newsrooms to collect questions together from people across Texas and get a good sense of sort of what are the things that people don't know that we aren't surfacing normally. So, a couple of other examples from 2018 about local races. So Nashville has this crazy, huge transit plan that was up for a vote earlier this year. It was going to be billions of dollars. And it had the city talking in a way that, like, I was visiting at this point in time, and like every cab driver I had, the hotel check-in clerk, like everybody was talking about this transit plan because it would have completely changed how the city sort of operated. And when I went to the station, they were like, well, I think that everybody has already decided on how they're going to vote. I don't think we've been covering it as much as we can possibly cover it. There's really no stone unturned. And I was like, well, just try. Just see what happens. If you invite audience questions and you've answered all of them, well, you get to send your already published stories to those people, and it's still good. But they ended up getting in 94 questions, and 39 of them were things that they hadn't reported before, and so they were able to report out really quick stories. They sort of grouped them into these 3 batches and like went through and numbered them. The reporter, Tony Gonzalez, also did a really good job in all of these stories of linking to the primary documents that he was referencing about how the transit plan was going to work, who was campaigning for what. There was also a lot of misinformation campaigns from both sides in this race, and this was a way for the station to try to sort of address rumors and fake news and things like that. So that worked out really well earlier this year in a local race that a lot of people were paying attention to but didn't quite understand. And then this is the last example for now, but in 2017, for the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, when it was very clear that our government was going to be working a little bit differently than normal, New Hampshire Public Radio decided to just do a 100-day series that said, what are your questions about the government and the people who run it? The tagline is, what you learned about in school but may have slept through. So it was just sort of basic government questions. They have received hundreds of questions. They've done more than 100 episodes at this point. It went on more than the first 100 days because they got sponsors. They had Blue Apron, they had CPB. Like, everybody wanted to be attached to this thing because it was teaching people about how our government works and who is involved in government. And so they are starting up in a couple of weeks with their next mini-series, which is all about midterm elections. And again, it's just like so many questions from people around the country and also in their local area about how government is supposed to work and how it is actually working. So.
Great. Well, Ashley, your team at KPBC in Los Angeles pushed this idea sort of further. It's more than just asking questions, but almost directly engaging with individuals in something that you described as the Butterball Turkey hotline for elections. So tell us about the Human Voter Guide.
Thank you. So at Southern California Public Radio, which is the, I can never get these to work. So we operate KPCC, and then earlier this year we acquired LAist. we stress engagement at every level, and we really think about how do we do that online, on air, and in person. And going into 2016, we promoted one of our reporters to senior politics correspondent, and she was given the assignment, we want you to go out there and answer voters' questions. Where are they confused? What do they not know between this candidate or that candidate? And we spent a lot of time listening, and so we were doing everything we could to meet people where they were. And as we did this, as we engaged and as we listened, we realized the questions people were asking weren't so much about how do I decipher what this candidate's saying versus what that candidate's saying to, well, how do I know my ballot's being counted? Can I, do I need to put postage on my ballot? Does it still count if my 3-year-old has drawn all over it? And so they became questions about the mechanics of voting and not so much the politics of voting. And so when Mary Plummer launched this effort and sort of refocused or reoriented toward it, she was using, and I love this part of it, she was using completely free tools. She started using Google Messages and using Google Voice. As we moved toward 2018 and we said we're going to do this for the primary too, we have the luxury of being a ground source newsroom and a Harkin newsroom. And ground source, for those who aren't familiar with it, is an SMS text messaging platform. So what we did is we combined those forces to continue to invite and answer questions, but to also offer a text messaging service to remind people, when you're supposed to vote. How do you know when to register to vote? If you're somebody who has trouble keeping track of those deadlines, and I would say everybody I know is, and our newsroom too, it's really helpful to say, you know what, I'm just going to sign up for this and know that KPCC is going to let me know when I have to register, when I need to send my mail-in ballot in. And we were able to go from 2016 general election, 2018, have a 4-fold increase in our level of participation. We were able to break news because we had developed such a deep relationship with the community members who were using this, and I work very hard with Mary, our reporter, to ensure that everything's coming through with her voice. That we had folks telling us, I showed up at my polling place and my name's not on the voting roll, and this happened over and over to the point where we actually were the ones to tell the registrar that they'd left off names, and it ended up being tens of thousands of people who had been left off. This has informed the events we do, our on-air, our online coverage, and again, just the relationships we have. It was a really great way, and Julie and I were talking about this before, to set up our gubernatorial coverage because we had, I can't remember, there were 6 or 8 candidates in January for the first town hall of the year, and we collected 1,107 questions from community members. And what was so great about doing this with the Harkin tool is that we were able to take that embed and put it on sites other than our own. So as I did, mapped the participants were largely in areas that don't traditionally include a lot of listeners or members. And so we got much more diverse questions asked that then I worked with our digital, our data reporter to create a formula so we could really organize them. And so it not only informed the questions we asked the candidates, but our coverage moving into 2018.
So other than Mary, how has other reporters in your newsroom sort of picked up on this, and how has it affected how they approach their coverage of politics and campaigns and issues in the community?
There have been some very basic and pretty exciting sort of takeaways from this. One is that we know that we can do an event based around this. We know that there's participation. We just did an event around homelessness, which is a conversation we're having every day in Los Angeles, and because of the success of that gubernatorial town hall, we said, okay, you know what, we have 3 weeks to do this, but we are going to invite community members to ask a question that hasn't been asked yet around homelessness, to vote on it and to do an event. And we had, something like 75 questions asked, 150 people voting, and then 400 people RSVP for a conversation on a Thursday night in downtown LA about a subject that is really hard to get people engaged around. But specifically with politics, I think there were a couple of things. One, we learned that as we became this habit for people, which is such a huge goal for us, that they had expectations that they were setting for us. And so in 2016, we spent a lot of time creating a guide to the judges. And this was something that starting this spring, people were texting us, they were calling us saying, where are the judges? I want to know about judges. And for anybody who's tried to do a voter's guide with judges, you know that's hard, and it's one of those things you're like, is it worth it? For our listeners and readers, it's very much worth it. One other thing that really changed from this, other than sort of that growing excitement about listening and having that inform the work, is we realized through the questions people were asking that the deadlines that we think of around elections are not the deadlines that community members are thinking of. So we might think, well, we've got to get everything by that first week of November. But for all of the people in Southern California who are voting by mail, they want to know 2 weeks, 3 weeks earlier. And so we've completely moved up our calendar to reflect that.
That's great.
Oh, it's my turn. Here we go. David, hi. Once election day arrives, journalists have for years relied on exit polls to tell us the reasons why the winners won. Why is AP giving up on the exit poll this year?
Thank you, Peter. So this is a board from Dixville Notch, which is the little town in New Hampshire that famously counts their votes at like 12:01 on election day. So that initial look at the election, Clinton up by 50% over Trump. Obviously, we weren't going to go with that. But when we got the exit poll results at 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m. on election night, what they showed was that Hillary Clinton was going to win New Hampshire by 20 points. And at poll close, the gap had narrowed a bit, but it was still a substantial, easy victory for Clinton in New Hampshire. Does anyone remember what Clinton won New Hampshire by? 0.4%. So we had a poll that was off by 20 points. And what do you do with data that's off by 20 points? Well, what we did was we set it aside, and we didn't use it, because we couldn't trust it anymore. And we knew that this day was coming. The exit polls had problems for a long time, and it's because of the way that it actually works. It's its actual methodology. When Nixon was reelected in 1972, 95% of Americans voted in person at a polling place on election day. That number was less than 60% in 2016. And it's only going down. In places like California, where actually almost everyone votes by mail. I think actually everyone does. No, not Washington and Oregon, but California, a huge percentage of the vote is conducted by mail. That's 20% of the country. As distrust in media institutions has arisen, guess what? That applies to the exit poll as well. There's a whole community of people in our country who don't want to participate in the exit poll. They see this as part of the media, we're fake news, and so the non-response among one half of the electorate has grown. And at the same time, one element of our society that's really, really into institutions are people who have graduate degrees and postdoctoral degrees. They love to participate in surveys. They do them all the time as part of their own work. And guess what? They tend to vote very Democratic. So you have one segment of this population going one way, not wanting to participate. Another segment of the population is super excited about participating. And it leads to bias that is really hard to correct for. There are other issues. There's lack of transparency in how the exit poll is actually conducted and what its methodology is. It ignores non-voters. We don't have, we're not Australia. We don't have 100% participation in our electoral system. So tens of millions of people who choose to swing elections by not voting, their opinions aren't captured by the exit poll. And the exit poll also focuses on battleground states. It's not universal. So if you wanted to know in depth after an election in California why people won in California, that data doesn't exist because that's a safe Democratic victory. We don't need the exit poll to call that race, so we won't bother. And so 20% of the country gets left out, and it's a lot bigger than that because the exit poll is traditionally just focused on battlegrounds. So we started over. We had done research for 10 years about how to improve this methodology, and ultimately what we concluded was that you couldn't improve it. You really needed to start from scratch with something from the beginning. And so we worked with NORC at the University of Chicago, which is one of the world's premier nonpartisan research institutions, to develop a completely new way to survey the electorate at the moment that voters are making their decisions and casting their ballots. And we, working with NORC, and I always say we, and I sort of try to take some credit for it. A lot of this, most of this came from NORC. What we're doing is we're taking the very highly accurate probability random sample, and we're using that to calibrate an online sample that's conducted via opt-in panels. And so we get the very rigorous, very accurate poll that's done by a random sample, but we also get the benefit of having a huge sample, a huge number of interviews that allows us to look in granular detail at the electorate. So rather than just being able to say what the vote was or what issues mattered to men and women, or people without a college degree or with a college degree, we're able to say this is what mattered to people who were white women with a college degree who make less than $50,000 a year. So we get a much more granular level of detail about the electorate. And we tested it. So in 3 statewide elections last year, we put this methodology to the test, and what we came out with was a validation that our approach was going to work, and we're debuting it this fall in the 2018 election. One note I always like to point out, in Alabama, a very odd race. We sort of figured like this was either going to tell us we were completely off track, or if we could figure out the Alabama race, we would know we were onto something, and our poll was really, really accurate in Alabama, and correctly predicted that Doug Jones, or correctly showed that Doug Jones was going to beat Roy Moore. So just a little bit more details. So in the space of 6 days this fall, we'll conduct 122,000 interviews. So those are completed interviews. That's not just phone calls or not just interactions, but those are 122,000 people who have completed our survey. We're in the field for 6 days, right up until the moment polls close. So if someone logs in or picks up the phone at 6:59, we'll complete that interview and include it in our data. And we'll do that analysis in real time, so we capture that data on election night. Results are available for statewide races, including all Senate and governor elections. And again, we sort of break this up. In 25 states, we use this combination of a probability-based survey and opt-in that takes place entirely in a state. And then in the rest of the country, we calibrate the opt-in sample using a national probability study. So it's a great map. The only place that we don't have color this year is in places that don't have a statewide election. So we'll be able to provide data and exit poll data, or as we call it, VoteCast, excuse me, data in every state where there's a statewide election this year. And we're trying some new things with data visualization in what we provide to customers and what we provide. So anyone who's a subscriber to AP will get these types of graphics and these types of visualizations. There's access to a dashboard so your teams can dive into this data and really try to understand your communities, understand the electorate and what took place on election day, and be able to explain it better than you ever could before. So our expectations is that we're going to be able to provide from this election moving forward accurate, trustworthy results that are free of partisan bias. We're going to reflect the true demographic makeup of the electorate, which is really important. If your data shows that 50% of the electorate has a college degree, guess what? You don't have a poll that's really accurate. We're transparent about a methodology. We'll apply all the standards that we do for our AP and ORC polls, in discussing our methodology and releasing our data over the long term. We capture both voters and non-voters. So you'll be able to look at our data and see, well, this is why people chose not to vote. These are the issues that the non-voters cared about, or this is why they choose not to vote. And some of the initial responses we've gotten are some of the things that Ashley's described. It's just hard, and so people say it's too hard, and that's why I wasn't able to vote or chose not to vote. And we'll have results from everywhere, beyond battlegrounds to every state. And we really hope that this inspires journalists to do more with this type of data and do more reporting about what takes place in their communities, because it'll be universal and it'll really have access available to anyone who wants it. As part of your AP service, so you do have to be an AP member. So that's my deal, and we purposely set this up so that the whole second half of the presentation could be questions from the audience. So we're eager to talk with you about all the things that we've talked about today, and hope that you guys have some questions.
Sorry, I'm just a little bit more curious about VoteCast. Does that mean you're not in the exit polls for 2020? Are you out of the consortium?
That's correct, yep. So AP is not part of the national election pool anymore. We will not be doing an exit poll, we're just doing VoteCast. Fox News is, joined us in that regard, and they'll be using our data like they used the exit poll data before.
Hey, really interesting stuff on VoteCast. Are you going to be able to segment by congressional district?
So no, not this year, and probably not in 2020. It's always something that we'll be looking at long term. Does the science allow us to evolve to the point where we can break things down by congressional district? It's not something that we're able to do now. It's certainly on the wish list long term. We are able to use the data to segregate results by specific areas of a state to sort of help us calibrate it and test its accuracy, but not something that's reportable, unfortunately. Everything's by statewide.
So it's going to be hard to get really visibility into, say, the makeup of the House, what that looks like going into the election.
On specific races, yes, that would be right. But we will ask some sort of generic questions on the survey about people's choices on the House ballot. And so much of the survey is not just about vote choice, but it's about attitudinal questions. Mm-hmm. So what was motivating voters, what issues they cared about, why they chose the votes the way that they did. And so that data should help illustrate what's taking place in the House. And certainly, on the other side of the aisle, or excuse me, the other side of the building of the Capitol, all the Senate data will be there as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for this. So I'm really interested in Cortico's earshot, particularly in regards to the data that you're collecting. Are there any plans to open that up in an API to let other agencies, developers, kind of pick that data apart and make it available in different ways?
Thank you. It's a great question. So we're part of a research lab in the MIT Media Lab, and so we're always thinking about these sorts of things and how our data that we're taking on. We're putting a lot of effort into collecting this data and making it useful for us and for our users. And we see down the line opening up an API and allowing some kind of open access that allows researchers and potentially journalists to interact with that. That'll be probably a couple years away, but it's in our roadmap. Yeah, thank you.
What about embedding?
To easily share a radio segment or something like that. So. It's a good question. We do want to eventually make it as easy as possible for journalists to take what they find and make it something they can include in stories. We see right now the tool as something that's more early on in the discovery process of generating a lead that you'll have to still go verify and go do some additional research on. There are some tricky parts around embedding direct radio segments onto additional platforms in terms of fair use or copyright violations, and so. That's right now. Our lawyers are just saying, the user is liable for their usage of what they find. If we can figure that out down the line, of course, we'd love to make it as easy as possible to reuse what you find.
Great, thank you.
This is a VoteCast question. We've been doing work in rural areas where there are no news organizations. And I'm interested in whether your methodologies, how they handle those kinds of rural places.
Absolutely. So our setup is designed to, like any poll, be fully representative of the population that we're serving. So when we draw the sample for the probability-based poll of registered voters, that sample is drawn to be representative. So it's not just including urban areas, but rural areas, suburban areas. We specifically set it up that way to capture opinions from everywhere. One of the sort of interesting things that we experimented with in 2017 that is, I think, going to be kind of really, really cool is those response rates to telephone surveys continue to go down, and it's very difficult to get a good response. You sometimes have to call people 10, 15 times to get a response. With younger people, the response rate is very poor for phones. So one of the things that we're doing is that we're sending a postcard to every person who's in our sample. They can look at, with that postcard, there's a PIN number on it. They can call us to take the survey, or they can also log in online and take the survey. And one of the, I personally found to be the most fascinating things is that our response rates for young people were great to the mail, as opposed to the telephone. So they didn't want to be bothered on their phone. And sometimes the phone call, we sort of see in the data, they would get the phone call and they remember that they got a postcard, and then they would log in to the website or on their mobile device to take the survey. The phone was almost like a prompt to get the response.
Hi, I'm Stuart Watt from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. We have done a fair bit of work with Harkin, with Julia's team, and not just, and we've found it, I've found it anyway, a particularly useful tool in getting out to do exactly what you guys are talking about, which is find out what people actually want us to report, rather than what we think we should be reporting. And not just in politics, but across a broad spectrum of just what's going on in people's neighbourhoods. Unfortunately, not every journalist is as open-minded as I am to that as a concept. A lot of people in our newsrooms think that asking the audience is a really poor idea, because what the hell would they know about what's important? And so I was wondering if Julia and Ashley in particular, but anyone else, you know, Peter and David as well, could just expand a bit on tactics for breaking down that cultural barrier which exists in some newsrooms.
Yeah, definitely. I think Ashley also will have a lot of experience with this. One of the things that we've seen can help a little bit is when you do have those sort of like early believers who are really, who do sort of get it right away, to have them just run with it and then show off those success stories, and then just sort of like bit by bit try to convert more people in the newsroom. Trying to do like getting the whole newsroom on board with something at once is always a little bit fraught. So moving bit by bit. Also, it can be helpful to frame things as an experiment. Like, we're going to try this for a month, or I'm going to ask you to do one of these kinds of stories, and if you hate it, I'll never ask you to do one of these kinds of stories again. But most of the time, they realize that they don't hate it. It's actually really fun, because you get to talk to readers who actually appreciate the work you're doing. So I think sort of the mix of starting with the advocate and the person who's really excited, whether or not they're the best person, as long as they're the person who has the energy and will do it right. And then also sort of framing things as experiments and as short-term things, and just letting people sort of try it out without making them commit to changing their jobs forever, even though if your long-term vision is that their jobs will change forever. So.
I'm making notes because I have so much to say here. I would say that there are a lot of different ways that you can approach this. One is to, and this is something I'm really passionate about, model the engagement you're trying to do externally, internally. And that can be, you know, we've actually experimented with using Harkin internally. So like, how can we surface the questions that our own journalists and staffers have about what we're doing? Actually, Peggy and I work together at Journalism That Matters, and so how do we bring open space technology or other kinds of conversations into the newsroom if that's what we're trying to do outside of the newsroom? Have coaching available. Find those allies, and FOMO is real. So get people excited about this other project that's happening and want in on it. I actually made a trophy, and I give a trophy out every month. Everybody signs it once they've won it. So you're encouraging that behavior regularly until it becomes a habit. Look for a community of practice. I'm on the steering committee of Gather, and you can learn more about it at letsgather.in. There's a really robust Slack workspace where people are not only sharing successes, but asking for advice. Every Friday, we talk about the best thing that's happened that week, and we're also working to build and share out case studies so that as we realize that we are not, you know, so often those of us who work in engagement, we're the only one in our newsroom doing that work, but there are a whole lot of us all over the country, and so it's just how do we harness that enthusiasm and experience to spread this idea. One last thing, just before I forget, I wanted to say, you know, we're talking about building new tools. It doesn't mean at the expense of things that already work. And so, again, with Journalism That Matters, we've been using postcards for surveys, and it's been extremely successful because right now, that does have the highest level of response. Also, you know, sometimes you just want to put a flyer up in a library, and that works really well too. So as we're building new technology, we don't have to abandon the things that have worked for hundreds of years.
I would have to imagine too, when folks started breaking stories using these approaches, that also helps as well. I mean, when you get scoops, that's got to be exciting in the newsroom, especially if you thought that well was dry and there was nothing left to report there.
Sorry. So Julia mentioned it earlier. We did coverage of the wildfires last December, and we had 108 people send us questions, and I'm very proud of the fact that we answered each and every one of those questions. And this was with a reporter who was very hesitant to get on board with Harkin. But she was assigned to it, and when she did, she won a regional Murrow. She's up for an award tonight. She broke news, and we were able to answer those questions that were really interesting on air, that mattered a lot, that had this broad reach. But also, we answered the questions one-on-one of people who emailed, "Here's my address, is my house still there?"
Hi, I was wondering a little bit about when you talked with some of the Harkin projects about the number of questions that you got and the response rates and that kind of thing. How do you, in a newsroom where we're all making strategic decisions about where to spend time, how do you measure that a project was really successful? I mean, I think it seems like a really rewarding process because you can really feel like you're doing a public service, but how do you measure it in a up the chain sense, like this is going to get us that? The other thing is I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, but we, there are parts of our viewing area, we could blast this on social media and all over our digital platforms, and we would reach a lot of people, but there are definitely people within our viewing area. Rural internet is a big problem, and how do we make sure that we're in some of this same frame, reaching people who are not available by some of the channels that seem native to some of us?
I'm also from Madison, so yay. So in terms of setting goals, we sort of work with newsrooms at the start to set organization-wide goals for journalists, and goals for the business team. And then we show those goals to everybody, so you can get a sense for okay, so organizationally we're trying to build trust. The journalists themselves is trying to feel more fulfilled and feel like their audience actually respects them. And then the business side goal is either increased page views or conversion to membership, higher subscription rates, things like that. And so we try to sort of work with people at the start so that they get a sense for what are these goals, so that when somebody asks you, why am I doing this? Why is this worth my time? You can point to that. In terms of how do I make a decision as an assigning editor whether this is worth my reporter's time, I think that's when using the sort of voting rounds is really useful, because you can say, okay, here are 3 questions, but I know that each of them is going to take several days for a reporter to get an answer to. And before I have a reporter spend that time, let me just validate that this is the one we should be spending that time on. And so your audience will vote, and they can leave their email addresses after they vote, so you have this built-in audience that you can send the story to as soon as it publishes, which is not normal, and is wonderful because they share everything. Do you want to talk a little?
I just wanted to add, how many of you have been at the editorial table when an editor says, well, that's not news, or that doesn't matter? Yeah. And how frustrating is it? And so especially when you represent a perspective that's maybe not the mainstream in your building, Harkin provides and listening provides an opportunity for us to say, you know what, when we open this channel up, this is something that comes up over and over and over. When we had those 1,107 questions from community members, primarily in South LA and Aliso Canyon, homelessness, housing, and affordability came up more than any other topic. And so we were able to say, here's a listenership that's not our existing listenership, but this is what's most relevant. And every time we have sort of that broader ask, this comes up again and again. One thing I wanted to say about not having internet access, again, I'm a really big fan of in-person. And you can do, we will often do in-person collection of questions, and then you tell me what the best way to get back in touch with you is, and we'll let you know what's going on with your question then.
I just wanted to add a comment onto the end point about access in Madison and rural areas and things like that. We think about that at Cortico as well, and in our initiative for community conversation centers where you can come and speak. The idea behind having them in libraries or community centers is that these are places anyone can go to. I mean, no matter what method you do, there's going to be some people that can't contribute, right? There's always going to be some demographic bias there, but by trying to select locations that are open to anyone, that they can come to at their leisure, essentially, we hope to help serve those people that are not being currently served by existing methods. This is still early on, but we will be in Madison this fall and early winter, so look for us there.
Hi, my question centers on how you engage young people in these processes, so like 15 to 18-year-olds. It occurs to me that a lot of these tools would be really into it, the idea of answering questions and then knowing that their question was answered. But I also am aware that they're not listening to public radio or really taking in any kind of mainstream media. So I wonder if you've thought about trying to get these tools to the places where they are, both to drive them to your, to become news users, to develop those habits, right? But then also to maybe put your answers in places where they are, like YouTube and Instagram, Snapchat, that sort of thing.
Just a short answer for this. So for us in our upcoming Conversation Center work, something we've considered is, well, our setup is that we have a facilitator that you come and speak to, and you share your concerns with that person, and which is gratifying. We found in experience is that having someone listen to you and actually care matters. What we're considering as part of the pilots we'll be doing is enrolling or engaging with high school students, seniors in high schools, to be that facilitator and to be involved in the community in that way, and we feel like that'll have an interesting effect in engaging young people and help showing them how to engage in the civic process going forward.
Two examples that have worked pretty well. One was in Chicago. There was a year-long project as part of Curious City, which is a Harkin series at WBZ, to try to improve their outreach into communities and demographics that they weren't already reaching. And the most successful one they found was partnerships, particularly partnerships with libraries. So they set up tables outside libraries in neighborhoods in Chicago where the library is where people have internet access. And so that's where the teenagers hang out. And so as the teenagers came into the library to go on Facebook or whatever, they had a chance to ask questions, and they asked really great questions. And they asked one like, what's the history of dance moves in Chicago? And so they were able to take that question, and they answered it, and WBZ, which is a radio station, answered it as a video and put it on YouTube because that's where the kids were going to be able to see it. So really sort of thinking about like, oh, the person who asked this question, what is the best format for me to show them the answer? And it was a fantastic, fun video. Another good example that's a little bit more serious was in Milwaukee. They were doing a whole series on segregation because they got so many questions in about segregation just normally that they said, okay, Noah, send us your really specific segregation questions. And then that led them into another series called Race Matters, which talks more about other race issues in the city. And they got some questions from some young black men at the high school who said, why does the media cover us so poorly? And so they brought together those students and people from different media outlets in the city just for like a small intimate conversation that they taped as a way to the best way to talk to them is face-to-face and to really let them push back on your answers. And so it was like a really good back and forth. So I think it really depends on who you're trying to reach and what the best way to have that interaction is.
I would say there's never a field trip request that I turn down. And one of my favorite projects was going into the 2016 election. I had all of these, I had first graders, second graders, and sixth graders during different ones, and they came in and we filled out, if I had a vote, I would. And it was amazing what they said. Everything from like, we would have some regular spaghetti day to I would invest in a strategic defense plan. And it was like, wow. So there's that. And then it's also thinking about with all of this, it's because we're so deadline driven, it's really easy to become transactional or to try to fit people into one specific lane of our journalism. And so I really advocate for being as relational as possible and saying, we might not earn their trust initially talking about politics, but hey, we have this storytelling series we're doing, and we now have all these 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds who want to be involved in that. So we start there, we earn their trust, and then we move into that conversation.
Hi, I am from India. So my question is in Indian context. People have lost faith in pre-polls and exit polls there. They believe that most of these polls are sponsored and various parties use this data to propagate their own agenda and to project their winnability. As a political reporter, when I travel to the interior places where there's hardly any internet literacy, there's hardly any access to so-called internet journalism, and there's still feudal structure despite getting independence from Britishers. I mean, it's been 70 years. So in that feudal structure, when you ask those voters who are like laborers, farmers, whom are you gonna cast your vote? They'll be like, you tell us, whatever you'll say, we'll do. So it's that feeling. So you realize that as a reporter that you need to dig deep. You need to talk to them for maybe 15, 20 minutes, or maybe then they can open up about their political preferences. But at the same time, as you have that constant pressure that all the pre-polls are predicting, or most of the pre-polls are predicting that this coalition or this party is gonna win. But when I'm roaming around in the field, I'm getting a different vibe. So that puts you in a fix that, am I getting it right or they are right? Because they keep telling it, all the poll agencies, that we are very scientific and this is about sample size and blah, blah, blah. So that's my question number one, how to readjust your political strategy, reporting strategy. Second question, you were talking about reader engagement and asking them to put their questions and everything. We are a nation of 1.3 billion people, and because of this, 2 years back, there was this company which launched a really cheap SIM. So all of a sudden, everyone has data to spend. They have free GBs and they're always on internet, but they haven't been there gradually, so they don't have that much sense of internet. So whenever I go live, I'm a YouTuber as well, they are around, and when I do Facebook live, so there are around 7,000 people watching you live. And 90% of them are like, hey, hello, hi, take my name. I mean, they're just happy about it. You just take their name, hello, hello, Shabana, hello, Ram, and they're like, yeah, you took my name. And then you miss few questions because it's like a flooding of questions. And then they're getting angry. You missed my question. And then they start questioning your intentions as well. So what to do about that? How to filter that? And the third question is, all of you, especially you, sir, you were talking about online polling. In India, there are political parties ruling and in a position who have dedicated IT cells. They're volunteers. Their only job is to identify, okay, this news publisher, this organization is running a poll. They are asking people to rate my government or fix the agenda. Let me go and set the agenda there. So all of a sudden, there will be a cyber army and they'll swing the voting character. So what to do about that? Thank you.
Okay, 1 through 3. So on the first question, first off, I should say that like my expertise here is very much focused on polling in the United States. So I have not spent much time thinking about the conditions in India in terms of access and how surveys are done. But in response to your first question, I think the best thing that we can do to engender trust of the people who we're asking to take surveys is report back results that they can have faith in. So if we had continued to stick with a methodology that we ourselves didn't trust and had to wait so aggressively to get data that we thought was accurate and reported that back out as a definitive answer on what the outcome of the election was and why it happened the way it did, we're doing ourselves a disservice because we're not engineering trust in that data and in what we're reporting. So we need to have faith in what we're doing, and we need to be working as aggressively as we can to make sure that our methods are returning data that's accurate, so the people that we're talking to when we do the surveys, and then people who, when they consume the surveys, have faith in it, and they know that it's a representative of what the actual opinion of the electorate is. I'll jump to the third question, just since I've had the mic and we can stop with the charade. So it's a great question, and one of the things that when we do our surveys online for a VoteCast, they're not sort of opened up to anyone on the internet. So that it's not as if that online piece is you see an ad on a website or something pops up on your phone and you can take the survey. We use what are called online panels. So these are large groups of people who have signed up to take surveys with a panel provider. And there's no attempt to make those panels representative of the population, but there is an attempt by the panel provider to make sure that those people are real and that they're confirmed. And they're not bots and they're not people who can be rallied. And the way that we do that survey, both on the probability side and then on the online side, is that you're invited to take part in the survey. So you have to engage with us after we've engaged with you. So a campaign, for example, couldn't raise an army to come try to sway our results. The other thing about Votecast that's specific to this context is that our results are always published after Election Day. Well, I should say, after polls close on Election Day. So the return on investment for a campaign to try to monkey with our results is really small. We're not releasing any data until after polls have closed, so there's no opportunity for someone to see our results and be swayed to vote some way differently. So there's just the return on investment to try to monkey with our data in a way that would cloud our results to achieve an aim is really, really small. And so for all of those reasons, we feel good about how we're addressing that problem that you outlined.
So the question about how to filter through when you get some people who are just saying hello, and also other people who have questions that they very seriously want answered. And I think it's a matter of sort of what tools you are using. Facebook comments is, especially Facebook Live, when you have Facebook Live going and the comments are just whirring by, it's so hard. So that's why I think that using other tools like Harkin, but also Google Forms or something else where you can sort of filter out maybe by response length or by keywords to sort of get to the ones that are the most serious.
And just saying at the outset what you are capable of doing. So if you, and that's what Julia said earlier, making clear, we are going to answer as many questions as we can answer responsibly, not saying, I'm going to try to get to everybody, because we will never get to everybody, except that one time.
I want to thank everyone for coming today. I'm glad you had hopefully you had a great time and enjoyed ONA. And thanks for all the questions. If you want to follow up with any of us individually, I'm sure we'll be happy to hang out here for a few minutes up front. So thank you, everybody.